Good morning and welcome to the branch. Thank you for being part of a new initiative here at Culpeper Baptist as we just try to create additional environments where people can have faith conversations, get to know one another better, and hopefully we grow together in what God is leading us to do. So thank you for taking your time to be here today. This week we started a new series. We're calling it Fearless, and that's based on the theme of the summer camp that our teens went to last summer, the Passport Camp theme. And it was a great theme for our teenagers and for, I think, all of us. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you out of the theme of Fearless over these next 4 weeks. I want to start by reading the theme verse for the series, which is 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. And I'm going to read this out of the Contemporary English Version. Stay awake, stand firm in your faith, be brave, be strong. Everything should be done in love. You know, that's a powerful summary of what I think believers in our current culture need to be about. And this is a good series for us to work through as we think about ending a calendar year and as we think about moving into new places of life in our spiritual journey and the things that we're doing with the branch. You'd probably agree with me that fear is the dominant part of our cultural conversations. Fear is everywhere. Anything that goes for political dialogue in our culture is pretty much fear-based. It's people trying to scare you from one position to another. Many of our family relationships are based in fear. We're afraid that our children might not get the opportunity they're going to need to be successful in life. We're afraid for our marriages. We're afraid for family relationships that might be breaking down. A lot of fear in how we are parenting and how we are loving one another as husbands and wives. And so a lot of the family relationships and the conversations are fear-based. A lot of financial conversations, right, are fear-based. We're worried about our bank account. We're worried about the ability of our kids to go to college or to get jobs after college. We're worried about retirement. We're worried about unexpected medical bills. We're worried if the roof needs replacing next year. But so much of what we experience in our financial lives is fear-based. And then the one that really concerns me, so much of what we believe about God and his role in our culture is also fear-based. And sometimes when life squeezes us or pinches us, the shakiness of our faith that's built on fears gets exposed. And so through this series, I'm hoping we're going to talk about some things that will lead us back to a faith that is built on Jesus Christ and a faith that can give us peace in times of trouble. Here's the great and challenging news, I think, for us today as we look at this first story. Even in our fear, God still calls us. Isn't that really the story of most of the people in the Bible? They weren't looking for God to call them, but even in their fear, God was calling them. I want you to listen to a calling story from the book of Samuel, one that if you grew up in church, you're probably very familiar with because we seem to talk about this story from when we're babies to when we graduate high school. But I'm going to read this to us, and the scriptures will be on the screen. 1 Samuel 3, beginning with verse 1. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. And one night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. So he went and lay down. And again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And a third time the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." And then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. And so Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls, you say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." I think many of us feel like we struggle hearing God's voice or seeing God's activity. And some of that is because of the distractions of our lives. It's really hard to concentrate with all the things that are calling for our attention. So right now, I'm going to give us a little test on our ability to concentrate and not be distracted. I'm going to show you a 1-minute video, and this has a test in it. So concentrate and watch this video, and then we'll come back and talk about how we hear God's voice in the midst of a lot of distractions. Check out this video.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Did you see the gorilla? The first time I watched this, I was in a room with 100 people, and not one of us saw that gorilla. I'm hoping maybe somebody in the group this morning was able to spot that gorilla. Neuroscientists say that there are biological limits to what our brains can pay attention to, but it's hard to resist a blinking light on the phone that tells us we got a message, the ping of an email coming in, or a social media post. There's just so much that calls for our attention. And this idea that we're supposed to be able to pay attention to all the things of our world while also trying to be attentive to God just seems like a gap we can't cover. We often think of people who are attentive to God as folks who just kind of sit off by themselves with an open Bible and pray. And we say, man, there's so much in my life. How do I pay attention to the work of God? Well, they had different issues in Samuel's day. I think the writer of 1 Samuel is trying to tell us that those people couldn't hear God because they were too distracted. It wasn't that God wasn't sending out visions or his word. It's that people weren't hearing him. And in a lot of ways, isn't that what's going on with us? It's not that God's activity has stopped. It's that we're so distracted we can't hear. With all the interruptions, with all the distractions of our lives, how do we get aside and hear the voice of God? And you kind of go through the process that Samuel went through. When God first called Samuel, Samuel thought it was Eli who was calling. He wasn't expecting God to speak. And isn't that interesting? A boy and a man that lived in the temple, the house of God, weren't expecting God to speak. He hadn't been listening for God. Just wasn't something that people did in that day. And finally, that old, mature believer, Eli, realized that God was up to something with Samuel. And he told him that the Lord was calling him. And Samuel went back and lay down and waited and listened carefully for God's voice. I wonder what points us to God's voice today. What points you to God's voice today? We might give some traditional answers, music, sermons, I hope. some inspiring reading that we do. But I hope, and I think something that we're really going to have to make part of the culture of the branch is that we also are able to hear God's voice in conversations we have with people in the community who don't have a faith background. I think we're going to need to be able to see God's activity in our community in places that the church is not currently visible. We're going to need to be able to see God's activities in new ways through new people. And we need to hear God's voice in such a way that our hearts and our minds begin to change. Eli told Samuel that God was calling him. And when Samuel understood that, he became expectant to hear God's voice. Do we have that same kind of attitude? Now that we know God's trying to get our attention, are we expectant to hear what he has to say? Samuel was ready to hear. What events in your life or in the people around you's lives has God used in order to help you hear his voice? God called Samuel, and Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Isn't that an awesome thing to say, to live your life maybe with that posture? Lord, whatever it is, speak, because I'm listening. But do we really want to hear God's voice? See, we got to be honest about this, don't we? God's voice is a disruptive voice. I've never known God to come into anybody's lives and say, you know what, I love what you're doing, exactly what you're doing. You just keep doing what you're doing because you're doing it well. That's never the voice of God. God always invites us to do something we are not currently doing. You're sitting in the branch today, doing something you don't normally do. And if we hear the voice of God, and please get this, we'll never be the same again. That's the essence of moving from fearful to fearless. We hear the voice of God and we're changed because we know we're following him. And we want lives that'll be different and will be lived for his glory. God spoke to Samuel, and God speaks to us. I said a couple of weeks ago that God very much is engaging in conversations with people in our culture. God is speaking. We need to help each other hear his voice. And we got to be aware that we're often distracted by the things of this world, but by our fears as well. Our fear of not being enough, our fear of what could go wrong, our fear of failure. Isn't that kind of true of every character of the Bible? When God called them to, one, they had to figure out how to hear him and make sure they understood that voice, but two, the next thing it seems like they were afraid. How am I ever going to do what God wants me to do? But friends, in spite of our fear, God still calls us. So 3 questions I want you to think about. First, break down your day into morning and afternoon and evening. 3 periods of the day. What keeps you from hearing God when God calls you? Second question, how might you be seeing God's work around you? And then the third question, and you might want to work on this just by yourself for a little while, and maybe over the next few days or the next week have a conversation with another person. But the third question is, what type of person is God asking me to be? Friends, we can wake up just like Samuel did. We can realize God is speaking to us. We can realize that we can be fearless. And we can say to God, your servant is listening. I'm ready to go. Bless you as you go through this week, and I hope you all have some good conversations as you finish up this morning. Thanks for being here today.